I'm done. Like, I'll never work again. They said never come back.
Hello and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players. I'm your host, David Holloway, and I'm thrilled as always to be here with you. And I'm always thrilled to be here with my brother-in-arms, the Oates to my Hall, or maybe you're the Hall to my Oates, or I think I just said the same thing in reverse. Paul Bindig, how are you?
Mate, I'm going well, although, correct me if I'm wrong, aren't Hall and Oates these days not best of mates anymore?
Well, there is that.
Is that ahead of us? Is that where we're going to end up?
Yeah, look, I think that's a sign of success when you start falling out, so he's open.
Yeah, I'd love to be a squillionaire, and then we can sue each other for the rest of our lives. That'd be great.
Right. So, no, it's great to be here, and we don't mention Hall and Oates just in jest. Our guest this episode is Mr. Greg Bieck. As you'll hear, Greg has played an amazing role in both a production and playing capacity with Daryl Hall in particular, but also some Hall and Oates work and played on Daryl's House. I'm assuming, Paul, you've seen Daryl's House. What an amazing show that is.
That is Can I just say this to anyone who listens to our podcast or watches us on YouTube? If you haven't seen Live at Daryl's House, just go and watch it. It's the
great.
Best. I don't know any musician who doesn't like it. It's just such a cool show.
It is. It really is cool. So, we talked to Greg about his amazing career. It's a sort of a hybrid keyboard playing and production show this time, and he has lots of fascinating insights, and including some great stuff about working with Dave Stewart and lots more. So we'll let you go listen, and we'll talk to you after the show. Greg, how are you, sir? It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Hey, nice to see you, and I'm doing great. Thank you so much, David. Glad to be here.
No, it's a pleasure. And so I thought we'd kick off this episode just asking about your 2024 to date, and not that there's much left of it, but you've had a busy year, I assume, as usual. What's happened for you this year?
This year's been great. It's been a real toss-up. I'm actually working with a new band on Warner Records that I recorded about 30 demos for, and I got this one demo that really somehow made it upstream, and so I just finished the production and mix on it, and it was great. I had Aaron Sterling on drums and Craig Young, and I had taken a song that they had done on guitar and adapted it for piano and put all this cool stuff on it, and so I just actually mixed it and turned in the mix last week, and I think it got approved. So it was a very acoustic, organic, piano-based thing, and then I've done some programming and synth stuff, and I think I started the year working with this Christian artist who's popular named Ellie Holcomb. She's a really kind of acoustic artist who really likes textures and ambient sounds, and it's been a busy year. Oh, the Daryl Hall record with Dave Stewart came out this year. I think I recorded that the previous year, but that came out this year, and I bought the vinyl, which I love vinyl, so that was kind of exciting. So it's been all over the place, which it often is. Yeah.
No, and we're definitely going to talk about a few of those things you just mentioned.
Oh, okay.
So no, that's great. And so tell us a little bit to start off, Greg, about your musical upbringing. What started you off in music and gave you the passion that's driven you through to today?
Sure. Well, that's a really good question. And I was actually thinking about that a lot, like things that I heard as a young age. And I don't know, you all in the UK, if you know this, but we had this show called Mr. Rogers' World.
Yes.
Did you all have that? Fred Rogers? There's a Tom Hanks movie about that. But I was talking to my buddy, a great guitar player. He was like in Dave Matthews, but he's a big session guy. The music behind that show as a young age was this beautiful Lester something. I can't remember the guy's name. It'll come to me when we're done. But it was this great bebop jazz piano, and I remember as a kid somehow that music got in somehow, and it was all piano based, improvised, just unbelievable stuff. And I always just somehow was drawn to the piano. And I remember my grandmother was like a church organist, church secretary, and she had this piano. They moved, in the States here. We got Wisconsin, and they got Texas way in the bottom. They moved to the southest part of Texas, so they left me the piano. And I remember I didn't really have lessons when I started, but I'd kind of write the notes out in letters next to the notes and just like taught myself the basics, and then eventually got some lessons, and it got me going. I had this really great teacher. She's gone now, but she taught me to improvise, which thank God, because I wasn't going to make it as a legit classical player, because I'd kind of start making up my own stuff, and in Chopin or Bach, it's really not encouraged. But
just on that, Greg, you raised a fascinating point. So when you say she taught you how to improvise, I know that's hard to sort of frame up in an easy response, but what did you learn from her about improvisation?
Well, I think that basically the most simple thing is taking a chord, and she showed me how to. They had this thing they called mini style and maxi style, which I've never heard. I don't know where she got it from, but it was kind of almost like ragtime piano, where you'd kind of hit the root and the chord bounce back and forth. And so I'd take like these songs. The songs would have chord symbols, and she'd kind of show me how to move the chords up and down the keyboard. So I wasn't doing anything sophisticated, when I was younger, like adding chord tensions or substitutions like gospel, but it showed me that the notes are very flexible, and what you have down in this area, in the middle, and the the high end, it's the same thing. It's just up and down the keyboard. I think that made it really simple. And she wasn't pushing me to understand what a flat 9, sharp 11, flat 13. It just, I remember playing these simple songs, but the nice thing was the flexibility to kind of get beyond what was printed on the page. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, thinking about what you learned there, having that teacher was obviously quite inspirational, and said, okay, so here's a student who, maybe playing Chopin exactly as written on the page isn't for him, but here's something that he is interested in, and supporting you in that regard. Well, how old are you when that's happening? How does that then play out in your teen years as you maybe start thinking about playing in bands and then ultimately to becoming a professional musician?
Yeah. It's funny, we're shaped by the music around us, and, being in that age, pre-digital and then early digital, so the first part of your question to how it shaped, to playing in bands, well, I had literally no concept of what a band was or any of that stuff. I just had my little piano lesson, and I'd sit in the room with this older lady and play, and no idea. And then in where we were, you could join a jazz band, and I don't remember, they're probably playing like not Sir Duke by Stevie Wonder, but one of those kind of cool songs, and the music didn't have any notes. It just had letters. And I was like, oh gosh, what's going to happen? So I watched the band director, sit at the piano and play it. And I think at that day, the other keyboard player wasn't there. And so he just let me sit at it. And so I just started copying what I saw, and just, that's the best way to learn, is just to be thrown into a situation where you don't know what's going on, because if you knew, it would scare you and you wouldn't do it. So I would just go with the flow and be like, oh, okay, so he's hitting an F chord, and then he's not hitting the F chord. He's kind of chilling out in this section, and then he's kind of going up higher, and just kind of copycatting, I think. And that was kind of how anything for me kind of started, is kind of seeing and being thrown into the moment. Oh, then synthesizers. I remember hearing Pink Floyd's The Wall. We had this, my last name's Bieck. It's like a bird's beak, but it's German. It's spelled very funky. And we had the shop teacher, Paul, with really long hair, and my two buddies, they all had long hairs. We called them the long hairs. And I was a clean cut, super nerdy kid. And we had this band called Bieck and the Long Hairs that played at these football games. And I remember I had like my first keyboard, which is a Yamaha DX21. I couldn't afford the DX7. And the 21 didn't have the velocity sensitive keys, and it was an 8-op instead of a 16. I have a DX7 sitting right over here. It's funny, just smiling at me. But that DX21 was the starting point, and somehow I had graduated to a Mirage sampler. And I remember getting the samples from the Pink Floyd, We Don't Need No Education. And I had my record player, which is this giant wooden record player with an RCA cable going to the mono input on the Mirage. And so for these basketball games, my favorite thing would be play a clip like the sample of Pink Floyd's, whatever it was, We Don't Need No Education. And then we'd start rocking it. And I was like, this is fun, and I guess it was a band, so I just kind of doing my nerdy thing with it, and it was fun.
So how old are you at this stage, Greg, when this is happening?
Well, I know that early piano for me started probably maybe in third grade, but I had kind of figured out, remember the sound of music. My dad had all this sheet music stuffed into a piano bench. And so I'd take it out, look at it. And there's this old guy, I think, isn't that Roger Miller? Yeah, Roger Miller, which I think his sibling or his child is a singer-songwriter in Nashville. Funny, Roger Miller, sing along with Mitch Miller. Oh, Mitch Miller. It's all these old songbooks, and I'd sit there and try to figure it out. But third grade is when I actually started the lessons. That's when I was like, okay, I need to have some education on what I'm doing. So, and then the band stuff, probably by seventh or eighth grade, and I have pictures of all this. And man, I was nerdy, but back then it wasn't cool to be a nerd. Maybe it never was. I don't know, but but that gave me an outlet. That and the AV club and all that stuff. Like that was, I would get out of class just to go and play in band. And then later they had the Mac SE, and they were expensive. I didn't have one. I had a Commodore 64 with this. I don't know if anyone cares about this, but it had the cartridge, and it was Sonos, I think, and it had like an 8-track MIDI sequencer going to my DX21 with like one MIDI cable out of this cartridge, and you plug the cartridge in to play like Pac-Man or something, and you take that cartridge out and plug the cartridge in to have the MIDI cable, plug it into the DX21, and then I can orchestrate.
It was an amazing piece of gear, that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's cool.
I was going to say, Greg, I think there'd be a high care factor amongst our listeners and viewers about this stuff, because I think essentially we most of us, I think, if we're honest, we were nerds when we went through high school, and and so that's how we ended up being keyboard players, and I think we love this stuff. So thank you for sharing that. So I'm interested in, how do we go from Bieck and the long hairs to maybe something slightly more professional, and what point did you start to think, well, music could be a thing for me? Maybe when did that happen for you?
Yeah, well, this was a real, I don't know if you think of your life as these moments, but I have these moments in my life that are pretty crystal clear. And I had a pretty crystal clear moment, in high school, which, probably around 14, like when you're junior year of high school in the States here, you are basically looking at your college, because the next year, your senior year, you have to make the decision already. So the junior year, and there were about 3 schools, and I was really into programming. Back then, it was like BASIC, COBOL, Pascal, Fortran. I don't know if we touched on C, if that was even out yet, but the basics of programming. I was very into programming these little programs, and every program I made was the same thing. And like, you ask a question and show a picture, and then I go over here. It's like, well, okay, that took me like 5 hours to make this little computer program. And then music, I had both of these little things, and I was like, okay, well, music seems a lot more fun, but the computers are fun. But then the error checking and the bug checking, the hours of that were frustrating. So I remember having this thought, okay, music. And I thought, well, I want to go for the best, and I feel like I'm pretty good. And in Wisconsin, the competition wasn't like New York City or whatever. I mean, so I might have shot too big for myself, but I applied to Berklee and the Chick Corea Electric Band, which, oh God, I love Chick Corea. I got it really. Okay, so I was into like Tangerine Dream. I remember one of my first concerts was Tangerine Dream, and talk about analog synths. Yeah. Nowadays, it would have been $1 million worth of synthesizers on the stage. I mean, they had stacks of Rhodes Chroma and like all this killer stuff. I didn't even know what it was, and cables everywhere, and just brilliant show. That stuff. I was really into new age music, and I met a jazz guy who says, "You can't listen to that stuff. It's one chord. You gotta play bebop and jazz stuff." So then I got into jazz, and for better or for worse, I was really practicing bebop and transcribing Charlie Parker solos and stuff like that. And I applied to Berklee, and I ended up getting a scholarship to Berklee for making with 2 cassette decks. And then I probably at that time had a little bit better Mac, not the Mac Classic, but the next notch up. I did like Light Years from Electric Band, and I programmed it on my keyboard. And then I figured out, I don't think I had a multi-track. He had a 4-track cassette. My buddy, who was way older than me, he's probably in his 40s. I was like 18. He came over and like played soprano sax, and we did Light Years. And I did the drums and bass, and great track. I was actually listening to that recently. So I sent that in and got a scholarship to Berklee. It's like, okay, I can, it wasn't a full ride, but it's like, it's something like, it's like, okay, come over here. And And then I went from feeling like, oh, I'm pretty good, to I heard like Abe Laboriel was he was graduating the year that I started as the Paul McCartney's drummer. And when you'd walk down the lunchroom, you'd walk down these steps, and there was the practice room M1. And I was like, good God, who's that playing? Sound like the drums sound like an orchestra. Like, how many hands does this guy have? And I peeked in there, and Abe Laboriel Jr., Abe Laboriel's son was playing in the project band. And then I was like, oh my God, what happened? I'm in the wrong place, but I stuck it out. And fortunately, and man, that place was awesome. So, in the Midwest, in my little circle, Beacon the Longhairs, I was doing all right. But now we got like the best, and then Prince's drummer, he played a lot with him. He passed away. Ben Butler, who's Sting's guitar player, was there. Good buddy of mine. There's so many. Ryan Shore, who scores like Superman, all that stuff. Like Danny. I was there and buddies with all these killer musicians and players at that time. And I guess that's probably typical for Berklee. It's kind of a magnet, And some people say, oh, it's not cool to graduate. You got to be like John Mayer and go a semester and then drop out. But I stayed the whole time. So I wasn't cool. So I'm sticking around. I was an RA in the dorm too. And, everyone was smoking. I don't know if you can say this. It's a keyboard thing, but they're smoking pot all day. And I was just like, well, I'm never going to get anything done. So I remember having a fan in my dorm room just blowing the smoke away just so I could not have this contact high to finish whatever, And they didn't have math at Berklee. They had acoustics, which is kind of math, but, it was a fun place. It was a really good time, being in Boston and all that. I was lucky for my parents. It's expensive. God knows how much it costs now, but I remember working as an RA and we just sit and play music all night. And I had a 1/4-inch Fostex 8-track with some Sec weird board. And then at that point, I think I had an Emax, I had an SQ80, then I got a Proteus. I was always switching MIDI gear and flip-flopping. And I remember the SMPTE track you'd have to print and all that fun stuff. I mean, back then you had to really work to get stuff recorded. Nowadays, you pull out your laptop and let's do 300 tracks. But I mean, you had the efficiency of tracks back then. You had to make it count. So it's a fun time to learn.
Absolutely. And so, Greg, after you graduated, how did you merge into your first professional job? So when did you first start making a regular living out of music?
Yeah, well, the first gig I ever did, it was me and I think a friend who is might be up for a Grammy at Berklee. But so I took this commercial class and I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be hopeless if this is how I have to make money. But they said, listen to the radio and then cold call people and sell commercials. So I cold called this place called Daphne's Fantasy Photography, which I found out later was boudoir, like naked pictures. We made like Daphne's Fashion Photography and then I remember I did one for Ipswich Clam Bake, and I think for the fashion photography, I maybe made $75 for the commercial. But then out of Berklee, I got jobs playing I played on the world's nicest cruise ship. Like I played solo piano, and I played on probably the world's crappiest cruise ship, and then I worked my way up. But I played on cruise ships, and they always have solo piano, and so I'd literally sit there and practice all day because when the boat was at sea, there was literally nothing to do. There's no internet, and you couldn't sit there and stream, reality shows. So you'd sit there and practice all day. And so I remember on the cruise ship, I had the wind controller, which I still have. And then I had a small keyboard and a big keyboard, and had guitar bass pedals and probably an HR-16 drum machine, which I'd program all these beats in. And I'd be playing solos with my right hand and playing bass with my feet. And, just so I was making money. I was actually probably back starting sophomore year of college. I was probably, when I wasn't in school, I was making money playing on these ships. And, so now that's not like playing on records, but it was important for me to practice, So that's probably when I realized, okay, yeah, I can do this. I don't know if you remember, if you're in New York City, there was this block. It was the 48th Street in Manhattan. And that was the Music Row of New York. It's right where the ball drops. If you watch the Times Square ball, and there's a Smiler's grocery store in the corner. And then you have this street, and there was Sam Ash. There was Rudy's, which had vintage guitars. There was an accordion store. It was old Polish or Italian guy selling these accordions. And then there's Manny's. And I remember selling, music and, gear. And they kind of taught me the hustle a little bit. Some of these guys were merciless and how these New Yorkers, how they'd sell stuff. Like they'd be like, guys says, well, I got to talk to my wife. And you're like, oh, you got to ask your wife to make decisions for you. And just like this horrible, and you'd get a gold star if you made your commission, or a red dot, or a black. And if you had the red, which is terrible, if you had too many of those in a row, you're fired. So you had to sell all this music gear. And I sold Pro Tools. And I remember I had a JV 1080 that you could get stuff at cost. So I got Pro Tools for like half price. And I think I got the Roland, and I started buying synths. Just any dollar I had, I'd buy stuff. Just load up on, I didn't know much about microphones or tube stuff. Back then that stuff wasn't cool. But, it's more of the crappier stuff like Alesis, like nowadays, you want an EMT or something like that. I wish I was smart. I would have bought all that stuff up. But I had like a Quadraverb, and, maybe they'll come back in style. You never know. But yeah.
Everything comes back in style, Greg. Yeah.
Oh, it sure does. Yeah, right?
And I'm really interested, and I thought we might explore some of the artists you've worked with to come back, because we are actually fascinated with the recording stuff, and you've just mentioned a whole bunch of stuff there that I'd like to explore. But let's do it via some artists, and we might jump maybe even ahead to today, because I know you mentioned the Dave Stewart, Daryl Hall work.
Yeah.
So let's talk about just even that's probably the culmination of all your skills and experience. So tell us about your initial involvement with Daryl, because I know you've worked on a couple of his albums. I know you've been on the wonderful TV show Daryl's House, and then Dave Stewart been involved. Just tell us about that experience more broadly and what you brought to it.
Well, thank you. And you're helping organize my thoughts. So thank you, David, for the questions and keep me on track. So to get to Daryl Hall and to get into that session, there was a famous, he's still around, a huge mega producer, unbelievable talent, named Walter Afanasieff. And he was the keyboard guy. I wish I could show you pictures, but we had MIDI racks, floor to ceiling, like 4 of them, just stuffed like 7 Trinities or Tritons, and then like, with a Studio One Moogs, and all these just great synths. And that was in the early 2000s. I was his programmer engineer. I remember they had an SSLJ. And the reason I got to Hall & Oates is because Walter Afanasieff produced some Hall & Oates stuff a long time ago, maybe late 90s, early 2000s. And Hall & Oates was signed to Tommy Mottola. And Walter A. was Tommy Mottola's guy. So Walter A. wrote the entire Mariah Christmas record, and, tons of stuff, every Kenny G, like you name it. So when I was working for him, I was programming for I did Beyonce and Jessica Simpson and Savage Garden and all this stuff. And I end up getting to, work and watch his excellence and his skill of like working with artists and stuff like that. And anyway, Tommy, I'm not gonna say anything. I don't want to get, in trouble, but they didn't go so good with Hall & Oates, and they, so I remember I transitioned Walter from Opcode Studio Vision to Logic. And because I was really into Logic, I had started with Digital Performer and then gone to Studio Vision, and then we ended up on Logic. So Logic was great. You can do all this stuff. So that was a wonderful gig. But anyway, after I left there, I moved to Los Angeles, and in Los Angeles, I had a publishing deal with Warner Chappell, where I'd done all this music, having a great time. And I got a call from T-Bone, who was the bass player from Hall & Oates. And T-Bone ended up being one of my great musical mentors. And he asked me to come help and co-produce with Daryl and John in New York. And so I had my own, 5-foot-tall MIDI rack. And I remember it was like $5,000 to ship it to LA. And I had a lot of cool stuff in there. I had like mini Moog bass type stuff and a lot of Roland. I was really into Roland samplers. So I had 2 or 3 S760s, which I still have in the basement. I think I had an S770, an MPC 2000, and I think I had a really nice Waldorf Q, maybe. Yeah, I think that was in the rack too. No. So I took that MIDI rack with me and ended up working in. They were recording on the Do It for Love record. They were recording some great music. And I came in and started changing drums and parts, and they were like, "Oh, we love this." And remember, I think I really got the job. I got really good headphone mixes for the vocalist, and as an engineer, that is one of the great things you can do is you can make it easy for them to sing, and they get a sound that they're really excited about. Then they're like, "Oh my gosh, I just love how my voice sounds." Because at the end of the day, that's one of the most important things, the vocals, and if it's compelling. So I spent hours getting these headphones right, and I remember renting which ended up being a $30,000 microphone, but a Neumann M49 microphone, which is it's hard to go wrong with that microphone. You can put that in front of anything. And so I was like, well, it's a Hall & Oates. I mean, I want the best. And so I ended up spending all this money. But that kind of became my thing when I was engineering is, just making sure I get the vocals right, the best sound, the best environment, a fun vibe. And I kind of learned that stuff from Walter A. He says, you really got to get the artist to trust you, because at the end of the day, it's not the record label that's hiring you. When you do a production contract, it's with the artist. The artist gets an advance. They get their money. They have all their managers and their team. And when you sign that production contract, you're basically being hired by the artist. And then the artist is kind of your guy. So I ended up really just focusing on making sure that I was delivering stuff that got them excited. Because sometimes when the worst thing is if you're in the studio and someone, asks you, "Hey, can you play that one more time?" Like, "Oh, I did it right the first time." Come in with that attitude, and you got to make it fun. I mean, sometimes you're in the studio for 8 hours. You spend 2 of it playing ping pong or pool or tennis or goofing off or whatever. But that's all part of it, because you're like, you just get in this mode. And so I kind of learned all that from Walter A., just the whole hang and be positive. And I can't remember who it was who said this, but I just want to be useful, it's become my attitude in the studio, no matter what it is. And to always do my best, because another guy said this, like, when you're in the studio, you got to do your best, because if you start settling and doing kind of a crappy job, what if it becomes, you can't turn that off? What if that becomes your new best? You know what I mean? You get used to hearing this honest, and eventually you're like, you just, I'll just start settling and getting worse and worse. So, and there's a whole army of new kids coming out, that are unbelievably talented. So like a shark, you got to keep swimming. You can't just sit here. And so I had some really great mentors. I remember worked for this guy who was Shaka Khan's bass player, and I really got into bass and drums and the importance of having the programming or live drums and the bass all work with the melody. And that's with T-Bone. T-Bone was the bass player on Saturday Night Live for many, many years. So,
yeah.
And he'd make me sit around and listen to the Meters, and George Porter Jr. and Joni Mitchell Blue and all these great recordings. You just sit around and listen to music together. And, that's, that became a huge part of who I am and what I like and how I proceed today. All these lessons I've learned, I try never to forget them, because, if you don't learn the lesson, you keep getting the test, and so if I end up doing something crappy, it'll just end up biting me, down the road.
That's right. No, absolutely. And I think that's an amazing perspective. And you mentioned about not settling for second best. I can't imagine Dave Stewart is a guy that's ever settled for second best. For us down in Australia and in the UK, he's iconic, and obviously not just through the rhythmics, but his production work. What was your experience there, and what did you learn as both a producer and player from him, for example?
I was really blessed to get to spend a lot of quality time hanging out with Dave Stewart on this trip. I would go to the beach in the morning, and I'd see this guy, and I see him with a shirt on, so I'm not used to seeing him with his shirt off, but the guy had a lot of tattoos, and he looked really cool, and maybe that's Dave, and we'll kind of walk over, like, "Oh, hey, how are you doing?" And we'd sit there, and he'd tell me all these stories, and he even gave me a copy of one of his books that he had written. But it was a great experience, and what's great about Dave that you can't underestimate is keeping it weird. So like in Nashville, or wherever, New York or whatever, there's this kind of perfectionism. And boy, nothing sometimes can be more boring than perfectionism, like get this just right, or pronounce this word just right, or, sometimes maybe you need that, but the vibe and the groove and the the whole experience is so important. That perfectionism in music is, and he would tell me stories, and these are secondhand, they would say hearsay in a court of law, but like, I remember him telling me him and Annie Lennox would have this vibe where they had a ring, and you tell me if you heard this, and they'd throw the ring in the console, and wherever the ring landed, they had to turn up that fader. They had to crank it, and they were always trying to keep it weird. And we'd sit there and listen to recordings that he had done, and it's killer. And he, has really used the synthesizer technology to the best he can. I mean, how great does that stuff sound? And they had just the most minimal stuff.
Yeah.
He was one of the first guys to use that sequencer on that keyboard, Sweet Dreams or whatever. I mean, it's iconic. I mean, it's just legendary. So, but in the studio, it was really nice. Basically, we were doing this record. He had a big giant Neve board. It's right off the beach. It's a beautiful area. And they had the console, and then I set up my own rig in the other room. And he had a lot of stuff mapped out, and then give it to me. And then I'd start adding synths. And I'm really in love with this. Behind me, I have this blue Udo Super 6 synthesizer. Oh my gosh, what a great synth. And I end up putting that on everything. It's just, what a sound. And I even showed Dave, said, Dave, you probably want to buy this. And he was like, oh my God. So that's on every track. And then I brought a controller, and I have a zillion plugins. Dave is anti-plugin. He was like, and I get that. Like, I have a really great microphone, a great modified U67. If I use that mic properly, I don't need 40 plugins on the vocal track, and unless I'm going for a pop thing with lots of effects and stuff. But I try to recreate stuff as much as I can by moving a microphone, changing a microphone, playing with an analog synth, and then plugins, of course, they're creative tools. You don't want to eliminate a tool just for no reason. But that, man, I was sitting in there, and I'd send files, and then we had a cable going from the B room where the drums were to the main room. And so they'd flip a switch, and I'd play the track and they'd be like, oh yeah. And then a couple of times he'd come in, and I remember that the omnichord on one song, he's like, yeah, do strings. He goes, let's do weird strings. And he started playing the omnichord, and I happen to be, I play that thing all the time, and I play some accordion. So the buttons are arranged like my accordion buttons on the left hand. So I was like, oh, well, here we go. Let's go. So he held his iPhone over the omnichord, and I played this cool string chordal part on the omnichord, and then we MP3 the track from Dave Stewart's phone to the studio mega computer on the Neve, and that ended up being the string part. So he was, and I was thinking like, okay, it's Dave Stewart, he's gonna have these mega, Vox AC30s and these mega amps, and he's like, well, sometimes, yeah, or like he had this little tiny little amp that was like probably weighed about 4 pounds, and oh my God, that sounded good. It's very experimental, which I think that inspired me the most, just seeing how you've got all these tools. You don't have to sit there and do what someone else told you is right. Someone said, you got to use something with EL34 tubes or 12AX7 tubes, and you got to set it here, and forget all that. If you like it, it's good, so that was great.
So I was just thinking, Greg, when you were talking about the intro to Sweet Dreams, that iconic, synthesizer, sequencing, and as you said, as soon as someone hears the first two notes of that, they know exactly what that is. From your own perspective, all the different artists that you've worked with and the different collaborations you've done, either as a player or in the recording process, is there anything you look back on and go, that was me. I'm really proud of that. That's a decision I made or an influence I had that, that's something I really look back and I'm really pleased I made that decision or influenced the artist to try that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, there's a song that became a pretty big hit, Walter A. It was I Knew I Loved You Before I Met You. And I would do the same thing. I just love my own space. And so I took the track to Walter A's studio, and I added like the synth and the little moving drum loop, which became a huge mega hit. And, on my own, I was just like, well, I just need some cool little movement. And, I'm always trying to do that. It's many times, even, I wrote a song for Little Big Town, and I was like, okay, well, that started from something that I played. And I think it's important for me and for everyone to remember, like, these ideas, sometimes they come as a flash and then they're gone and you might never get it again. So I always try to record them. Not that I ever listen to all of them. I listen to some of them, but when you get that little flash of inspiration, just like one of the Hall and Oates songs, and you talk about mistakes and how they become good. There's these happy accidents. There's this one song that I end up becoming a writer on one of Daryl's biggest like records that we've done, the Christmas record. And it probably stemmed out of me like listening to his chords and playing it wrong, and he ended up liking it better. So, but it really changed the whole vibe of the song because I listened to it and I was like, well, this is what I probably just did what I would do instead of doing perfectly what he was doing. And he goes, oh, that's so good. And I go, oh, I'm playing it different. And he goes, yeah, that's great. I said, I didn't know, I was just playing. It's like, you know how you get in a space in your brain where you're kind of not analytical, you're kind of more floaty and going with it. I try to get there, instead of being in that, perfect vibe. And so yeah, that happens a lot. And there was a period when I was working with Walter A that hit after hit that we worked on, like with stuff I worked on. And it's a really fun feeling where you hear something you did and all of a sudden it's on the radio. So it's like a drug, and I'm kind of craving it. And now with this new band I'm working with, I just love that. So
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's amazing. Thank you. And I do have to ask, as a producer and a player, you get to work with a range of artists. So you've mentioned pop artists, and the whole gamut of what you cover. I'd argue two of the most critically panned but most popular and amazing musicians are Kenny G and Michael Bolton. So they're the people that, some musicians, I don't know what it is, but particularly down here, tend to mock or whatever. But I can imagine they're amazing to work with. And just tell us about what you learnt from working with people like that who have really wide appeal and have a particular, really distinctive sound.
Well, that you said it right there, the sound. So Kenny G had his rig, which was, I think, a TLM 170. And back in the day, then it was one of the DBX 160, like half rack with the wooden sides. And I can't remember what preamp. And then he had the 48 channel digital back then. And he would go and meticulously craft and get these great solos because he can play. Like, he can just sit down. And I know he started as a session musician. Him, Jeff Lorber, all these great New York session players, were making money doing sessions. But he would really craft and comp. And back then we were analog comping, not analog, I mean, not as in moving files in Pro Tools, but we're using a digital tape machine. We had these comp boxes. There was, I think, 16 buttons. And so a vocal phrase or a Kenny G sax solo would come through, and then you want to go. And when you push the buttons, it did an automatic crossfade. So you could push buttons in the middle of a note, flip tracks, and you wouldn't hear clicks. It was a very expensive system that was a non-digital system. You'd plug all the tracks into it, and you can just go beep, 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 and you'd hear different tracks. And meticulous. Oh my gosh. And Michael Bolton, just meticulous on those vocals, like the end of the world, just like, this has to be right. And just that kind of focus, I think, is what those guys both equally demonstrated. They were just super focused on what the vibe was. And Daryl Hall too, like sometimes he'd sing something and he'd be like, oh, I hate how I sound on that. And I'd be like, really? But see, Daryl Hall's going for this Philly soul, Marvin Gaye, like Isley Brothers, Al Green vibe. So he doesn't want to hit something heavy-handed. He can sing like a Michael Bolton, but for his style, he's like never going to want to sound like that. So they know they have this filter of what they want as an artist. And with this current band I'm working with, the singer's like, I can sing that, but I don't want to sing that. That's not me. That's not who I am as an artist. And as a producer, sometimes I'll think like, well, I really want them to do this, but it's their voice and I'm supposed to be amplifying their voice. So, I think with all these artists, it's getting them to trust you. I'm like the frame, where the music's all the frame and they're the picture. We're trying to maximize that, get the most resolution out of that picture. So that was a really good lesson with those guys.
Speaking of lessons, Greg, you made a comment before, which I think I'm going to steal. You said something like, "If you don't learn the lesson, the test will come again."
Oh yeah,
yeah. I love that idea, and I'm interested in what would you share with, let's say, someone was starting out as an aspiring professional keyboard player in the industry. What are some of the things you've learned that you'd love to pass on?
Yeah, that's such a good question. As a keyboard player, there's like a maturity level, right? That like now I'm older, than I was, and I think the best thing that that people nowadays can do as a keyboard player is really rely on their ears. And if I see a lot of young keyboard players, I see a lot of them going, well, this is the piano sound. This is like keyscapes. And this is the best because it's keyscapes. And I'm like, it's keyscapes, it's the best. I'm like, okay. So because you paid what, $400 for it, and it's like 30 gigabytes, that's the best sound. Like, what about this one here that's only like 3 megabytes and it's kind of sounds cooler? Because, so it could be like a dance song and you got this C7, 40 gigabyte grand sound, and like it's a dance sound. It's like, well, check out how funky this sounds though. Like, you know what I mean? Use your ears instead of the gear. I mean, that's been said to death, but that is something that I can fall. I'll get some new plugins. Sometimes my worst mixes is when I get a new suite of plugins, and I'm like, okay, let's use this. And then I'm like, God, this sounds terrible because I haven't found the good stuff. Or you get a new sample library. There's like 1,600 sounds, and there's like 5 good sounds in there. And you have to make your own sounds. So the most important thing is to thine own ear be true. Listen to your ear, listen to how it makes you feel instead of the technical stuff. And if you're playing, it's a universal thing. You don't have to be Corey Henry. Like, how good is Corey Henry or Jacob Collier or, Jesus? All these guys, so good, right? Yeah, they're really good. But, is that like the number one song on the radio right now? It's like a lot of really big mega producers and great keyboard players are bass players because, the bass kind of gets you moving and it gets you moving out of your seat. And the groove in the pocket, there's a reason for that. It's so it's this funny joke, like, what's the difference between a jazz musician and a country musician? A country musician plays 3 chords in front of thousands of people, right? And a jazz musician, play thousands of chords in front of 3 people. Like, that's good to do all that. And now it's better jazz is coming back, but there's no right or wrong way. And I've made that mistake where I've had people. I remember I produced something, it was successful, and someone came, you can't do that. You can't do that. And I'd be like, oh, okay, And then like, you can't listen to that. It's usually based more on their anger and frustration than reality. Because tell that to Dave Stewart. He broke all the rules with these recordings. They're smashes. One after another. From working with U2 to No Doubt to Tom Petty. It's one after another. The rule breaking is cool. So
that's right.
So yeah,
no.
Listen to the ear. Yeah, that's where it's at.
No, great perspective. Thank you. And look,
Yeah.
we will talk a little bit about keyboards, and you may not recall this, Greg, but the reason I reached out to you to come on the show, aside from your amazing career, is you actually utilised some resources we'd pulled together from other websites. So we didn't create these, but it was basically a tutorial on how to upload sounds to a DX7, and
I remember.
You very kindly emailed and thanked us for providing that. And again, I do check out the article though, is interested, because I do want to give credit to all the other people that it links to, because I've done nothing beyond pull it together.
Sure,
but just
it's
tell
very
us
helpful.
about
Though. Thank you.
That's okay. So tell us about your favourite keyboards. And I know you mentioned the DX7s there. Like, I'm fascinated in today's world. You're still using the DX7, and if so, how? But also interested in what else you tend to be your go-to pieces.
Well, I tell you what, I was given the DX7. I've been lucky, and people they find these things and they give it to me. So I've used it a few times, but not as much as I should. I really like it. I love the attack. FM synthesis, when it hits compared to analog, there's always this little delay, like you're waiting for the capacitor to heat up or whatever. And the digital's like, bam, it's like a cat. It's just like right there, where the analog is like a kind of a slow dog. And so I like it, but I haven't been utilizing it much. But I really love my Moog source, which is right behind me, for bass. It's probably because I'm too cheap to buy a real mini Moog. But the actual real Moog source for bass, oh my God, it's so hard to beat. It just sits in and I think mine is from some famous band in New York. I can't remember if it was Modest Mouse or one of those bands used it on a song. But man, that thing, and you know what I love about it too? The battery's dead. So every time I have to program in the sound, but I love starting from scratch, because every time I get a little bit quicker and a little faster, and it's got that memory kind of button where you push the buttons. But I mean, it is hard to not get that to fit into a track. Something about, I have Trilogy bass sounds, and there's a really good patch in the Trilogy plugin called ATC Creamer, which is the ATC1 Studio Electronics bass, which was the synth that I had. I love that synth. But I dial up basically the same preset on the source, and just because of the actual physical volts and voltages coming through there, it just somehow does something that the plugin doesn't do. The Udo is super great. And then what I've been doing lately that I've been really enjoying is using guitar pedals and stop boxes with my synthesizers. And for years and years, I resisted that because every digital synth has, zillions of digital effects in it. But the source and then the Udo are pretty limited in that regard. So I've been really enjoying my timeline pedal and my little, what is my other little, I have like 2 or 3 little pedals over here, the walrus and things like that. And I have a list of pedals that are on my list. But I go through cycles with, I really want to buy one of those Roland Super JX or JX10. I was at the keyboard store and I was like, I think I have to get one of those, even though it's going to set me back 2 or 3 grand. And I do have a Yamaha endorsement deal. I love my montage. Yamaha has been really good for me. And I mean, there's a lot of synthesis that you can just do in there. And so I'm constantly designing sounds. And you know what I love is like, I get a preset, once you get the fundamentals of what oscillators, LFOs, and ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release, once you get that basic stuff, you can go to any synth and you've never used it before, you'll hear a sound like, oh, that's almost what I want. Omnisphere, any plugin, and you can kind of craft the sound to fit where you need a slower attack and so I just encourage everyone to at least start with a preset you like and then craft it instead of stock, So I'm always, I do a lot of sound design. We do a lot of TV work here and always try and develop new sounds. That's the name of the game. So. Yeah.
Thank you, Greg. Now, we have a question we ask all of our guests, and with your level of experience, I'm sure you'll have something for us here that'll be worth hearing. We'd love to ask about a train wreck. So have you ever been involved in a situation, whether it's playing live or it could be recording in the studio, where there's been an absolute train wreck that you've had to work your way through?
Yeah. Oh, my God. Yeah. Like many. And the biggest one, like the one that really wrecked me, that very embarrassing, was me as a player on Broadway right before the Tonys, this huge musical, like at one of the biggest theaters. And I had learned the first act of a show. And as a pit player in Broadway, they're not looking for your improvisation skills. You have actors on stage that are looking for cues to sing their song. No one cares about the piano player. So anyway, I'd learned this first act of a show, but I remember the poor cat whose gig it was, this really nice guy, was helping me out. And anyway, he got deathly sick and was vomiting with his stomach flu. And back then, I didn't do enough homework. And I was only going to play the first act and I was done. So I was like, okay. So he's like, you got to play the second act. I said, oh, I don't know the second act. So I was kind of sight reading, and this was really complex jazz stuff. Like it was out there. And so I was sight reading. I was doing it. I can sight read. So I was playing it well. But what I did was the fatal mistake, just the worst mistake. They have these cues and you're in an orchestra pit and it's dimly lit, right? And so you're sitting there and, I'm kind of at this point near the end of the show. I'm feeling pretty good about myself. I'm on Broadway and like, woohoo, because for the first set, I'm pins and needles just following it. So I'm starting to relax my guard a little bit. And, people are making jokes because they've played this show 1,000 times. So good job, you're doing great. Well, there's a scene in this show. It's about hookers and pimps. And basically, there's all these songs and the main call girl, the character that built the whole show on, fall in love with, what a great person, tortured soul, gets shot by this pimp. And there's these horrifying like red lights, and it's this big scene. Well, in the music, there's this pencil cue written in the top, and it says like, hold a string note on, we're using Kurzweil. So whatever those PC-12 or whatever, PC-88, whatever that thing was back in the day, Kurzweil, and so you hold a high string note on patch number 7, and it was written in pencil. And so I didn't see that. And so the conductor just does this, and instead of going, and this is right before they're going to shoot this hooker, and they're all sitting there waiting for the string note. They've done it. instead of playing my high string note, I play ba-bum, 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 bum, it's like Harpo Marx piano, like friggin' craziest goofball piano solo. They must have thought I had a stroke or something, because they're all the whole theater, probably like 1,000 people. I don't know how many people go to these Broadway shows. The actors, the whole cast, they're like, what just happened? Like, oh my God. And you couldn't have, the whole show, you probably couldn't have made a worse mistake than that. And I remember David Spinoza, the legendary guitar player, goes, "Hey, good job, buddy." Like that. They told me never to come back. But right after that is when that girl got the huge record deal that got me started with Sony. So I was like, I'm done in music. I'm gonna work at, I don't know, be an electrician or something. I'm done. Like, I'll never work again. They said never come back. But then right after, I did all these demos, and this girl got a $4 million record deal, and they did all my studio, and I ended up getting I ended up working with J-Lo like a year later.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
but oh my God, for that night, I'm sure, like, that's, if any stomach ailments I have today, that's where I got them. Like, you couldn't have messed up. And it was right before the Tonys. It was like, and Cy Coleman, like this legendary, he wrote Witchcraft, like, there's all these brilliant minds. And then this doofus kid, like, plays the wrong song. I was probably 20 or something. I don't know. But anyway, that was bad. I mean, I still I remember it crystal clear. So that's my embarrassing.
Yeah, that's amazing. That is an amazing story.
It's pretty bad.
I feel, it is pretty bad. So what was the musical, Greg? Was it The Life or?
It was The Life. Good.
Yeah, there you go.
It was The Life. Oh yeah, that was really good. And it was a brilliant show. And the orchestration. I mean, there was so much masterful writing. I can't remember the orchestrator. He was one of the big art orchestrators. Like, the music was just brilliant stuff. And I appreciated that, because I went to school for orchestration, like at Berklee, arranging, and that was my whole thing. And to just take such a giant dump on the show and play the wrong song, I didn't mean to be, it was just so bad. And so anyway, but that, I worked out good, because instead of being the, Broadway pit musician, I ended up getting this work. I worked for Tommy Mottola right after that.
Yeah.
But, I still feel bad. Oh my God. They said
that was amazing.
They said don't come back anymore.
No, that's always a good feeling. Yes. And Greg, I do want to ask you, one of our other common questions is we ask our guests to tag another keyboard player. So is there someone out there as a player that you've always admired that you would love to hear more about their story?
Well, so one guy who's an artist, I really like Steve Winwood. I mean, and he lives in Nashville, but how good are those records, right? And there's a guy named Jimmy Braylauer who I met as a kid. As a kid, I remember, do you remember Keyboard Magazine?
Oh, yes.
Isn't that great? So as a kid, they used to have things called sound pages, and they had these little square records. And
that's right.
Fundamental for me being in music, and I still remember, is those keyboard sound pages, and you had to wait for it. It's not like the internet where you have terabytes of data instantly. You get that little thing, and that's what you get. Well, David Frank did a song that he wrote on one. David Frank was the system, and he had Don't Disturb This Groove. And I've talked to him, and he's a really good cat for synthesizer stuff. You guys want to talk to someone? This guy, he really influenced me. He's a generation older than me, and he did Christina Aguilera, Genie in a Bottle. But he would really use synthesizer like a synthesizer. And then Patrick Leonard was another guy. He was Madonna's guy. He was a brilliant producer. I really like those cats. Steve Winwood. I've got to work with a lot of people I love, like David Foster and Daryl Hall and Walter A. And and then today, some of these keyboard players, Jacob Collier, Corey Henry. Oh my God! I mean, it's so great. And I don't know about you, but I'm always trying to grow. So I see these little things on Instagram of some little lick or some little thing, and I save it, and then I take it to my piano and try to get it on my fingers so I can do it. So I'm fighting off dementia by trying to learn new licks.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's great. That's excellent. And then we have the dreaded Desert Island Disc question. Greg. Yeah. So your five albums that you couldn't live without, or.
Thank you for this. So I wonder if we'll cross over any, but I always really like Yes 90125. I probably bought that about 6 times
Yeah.
in my life. Owner of a Lonely Heart and Changes in this. I mean, for me, right? Oh, and I just thought of another one. Oh my God, Peter Gabriel. So like that. Oh my
Yeah.
God, that stuff, that recording. It's how so great. Uh, Chick Corea, Now He Sings, Now He Sobs. I think that's the name of the record. But oh my gosh, that band is incredible. T-Bone Wolk told me about Joni Mitchell Blue, and so it's not a keyboard record at all, but the voicings and her vocals on that and the experiment, it's just very soulful record. So not so much the keyboard sense. And then for me, like the best of Charlie Parker would have to be on there. I used to fight with anxiety and anxiety attacks, and when I couldn't sleep, I had a 1948 Silvertone record. I would record player. I would put on Charlie Parker vinyl records, and the combination of the smoke from all the tubes burning in the record player, and then the Charlie Parker music, I was always out. so I probably have anxiety on this desert island. And then Radiohead, OK Computer, like that.
Yeah.
In Nashville, we're in Nashville, we're hillbillies. My buddy calls it Rodeo Head instead of Radiohead, but Radiohead, OK Computer. I mean, that's, oh my God, it's just brilliant.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Great
and there's
picks.
so many more, but that's kind of a starter.
Oh, thank you, Greg. We'll list those in our show notes, and great suggestions there. Now, we love to finish off our show with what we call the quick fire 10. So we're going to ask you 10 quick questions. Give us 10 quick answers, the first thing that pops into your head. And I will kick off with probably one of the hardest questions, which is, what is the first album you ever heard?
Oh, my God. Okay, my mom had a record player. Okay, well, I'm not sure if it's ever heard, but I remember consciously putting it on all the time, and it was The Kinks. And it was on The Kinks. Yeah. My mom had a really good record collection, so it was The Kinks.
Nice. No, good one. Before a production session, Greg, or before a live gig, it doesn't matter which, what is a pre-gig ritual that you have to do to feel like you're settled before you either produce a session or play a gig live?
I usually pray and ask God to do the session for me, or pray, right before. So that's been something I've been doing forever, and I just did it recently. So yeah.
Great.
Nice one. Thank you.
In the bathroom. It has to be in the bathroom. I don't know why, but it's always in the bathroom because I'm probably peeing because I'm nervous. So.
Very good. Maybe the acoustics are good in there, even if you're doing it silently. I don't know.
Yeah, that could be.
Fantastic. Now, you mentioned electrician before, but I don't know if this will be your answer to this question. If you hadn't been a musician, what do you think your career choice would have been?
Probably computers or a pilot. I sell airplanes on the side, and I've always been fascinated with airplanes. So I flip these old vintage airplanes. So it'd be like computers or vintage airplanes, depending. My mom might not have let me do the airplane thing. I'm not sure. So probably computers.
And so I've got to ask, just you mentioned reality shows. Is there not a show concept in, Greg Bieck, Airplane Flipper? Surely that's a reality show in our future.
100%.
There's so many of them. There's so many of those shows right now, and they're freaking terrible. These guys are flipping airplanes and doing these crazy things that are so dangerous that it's like, but my friend talks to me about a show that he wants me to kind of just help with, and it's related to airplanes and restaurants. So I like the idea of like going to faraway places, in your little tiny vintage plane, and then like go to some cool restaurants. So that would be safer. Yeah. But the vintage airplane thing could be really dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Transpose button or adjust on the fly, Greg? It sounds like you've got the training to be able to adjust on the fly. You don't need the transpose button?
Yeah, I've never used the transpose button. And though I know a lot of people who do, and they're very super successful. So I have no judgment. It's just somehow it throws my brain off. Like, when I play, I know where things get muddy or too thin. It throws that part of my brain off where I end up sounding really muddy or thin in the pressure I'm pushing. But there's nothing wrong with it. So many great players use the transpose button. I was never good at it. So yeah.
What's the favorite gig you've ever done?
Ooh, I think my favorite. There's a Hall & Oates record where we did live at the Hard Rock Hotel, and it was the our kind of soul record, which I had produced, and it was on VH1. And I don't recognize myself on it because I think I was in kind of a dark period right then. But that gig was so fun, and it was with my buddy T-Bone, and we were all staying in a hotel and hanging out, and it was somewhere in Florida. Oh my God, it was so fun. That was a blast. So that and they filmed it. That gig was my all-time favorite. It was just wonderful. And every once in a while I'll watch a little bit of it just for kicks. The band, those guys, they're such great players. So that was really fun.
Great. No. And favourite city you've played, Greg, if that's possible?
Well, I think it'd be in the Bahamas, in this little island that I do some work at. That I love it down there. That's the whole culture and the whole vibe. It's great. So yeah.
Name a song that you used to love, but you've played it to death.
Oh, well, that's pretty easy. There's just so many of them. Like, okay, freaking Canon in D. I call it Taco Bell's Canon. Okay. There's this restaurant, but oh my God, that song just murders my soul when I hear it. I literally play it in two different keys, or Fear Elise. Like I have these, someone. It's not my idea, but Billy Joel's Piano Man. Someone showed me the way to play it as the whole tone man. So instead of walking down like diatonically in B flat or C, whatever, I do it in hopeless. But any three of those, like, oh my God. It's like if I don't make it to heaven, I'm in hell. Those will be on soundtrack. Those three.
Love it. Favorite music documentary or movie?
Oh, my favorite is the Stax documentary I just watched. It's really great. It's on HBO, Stax Records. Oh my God!
Oh, I need to check that out.
Yeah. Oh, it's brilliant. I just finished it. I was on a road trip, and brilliant! It's so great. Yeah.
What's one thing you would love to see invented that would make your life as a keyboard player easier?
I think like stuff related to the editing of tracks. There's so many things that I do that I know could just be like a macro, or I feel like automation into the DAW, some of the basic stuff that we all do every time. Or I don't know, just more automation. Because I have to do a lot of these songs, and unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time. Like it's always under a time constraint. Now, I don't want someone artificially intelligence. I don't want creating the art so much, but just slowing down, using the artificial intelligence to help the creative process faster and smoother. That kind of stuff. I feel like I have a lot of ideas for that. Just ways to make the process more organic and fun.
Yeah. Bring it on. No, that's great. And last one, Greg, your favourite non-musical activity or hobby? What keeps you sane outside of music and production?
Oh, I love running and spending time with my kids. So running with my kids is usually me chasing after them.
Yeah, great. No, that's excellent. Greg, I can't thank you enough for spending the time. It's hugely appreciated. And I know we haven't covered a whole swathe of what you do. But it's just been amazing getting your perspectives on what you have done. We can't thank you enough, and would love to keep in touch in the future.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm so glad. Thank you for, I remember I was looking at my DX7 and like, that's right, getting all those sounds. And I was like, because I remember as a kid doing this, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's so complicated. Thank God for having that info there. I'm so glad we met. Yeah, absolutely. If you ever, keep in touch, and if you ever need anything from Nashville or vice versa, you all are wonderful. And I really like what you're doing. I actually watched, I don't remember who it was, but I watched a couple of the interviews you all had. They're brilliant, really good. You have some big people. I'm kind of honored you asked me, but you have some big people on these. So thank you. Thank you for asking. This is a treat.
And there we have it. What a guy, Paul. What a guy.
Yeah, just really fun to talk to, as you've all just heard, and great sense of humour. And look, I think David, his career is so deep, and he's worked with so many great artists. We probably could have talked to him for 3 hours, but we have to respect Greg's time as well, of course. Do you know one thing that made my heart flutter? I was really delighted early on when he was talking about how he couldn't afford a DX7, so he got a DX21.
Yeah, I thought of you.
He and I are a similar age, or he and us are a similar age, and I was exactly the same, although I had a DX9. But it's very similar to the DX21 in that it didn't have as many operators, didn't have velocity sensitivity. Basically, it was a terrible version of a DX7, but that was all I could get at the time. So, yeah, it was cool.
And I think he's quite correctly not using it a lot. Like, the reason I had the stuff on our website is I bought a secondhand DX7 a couple of years back, and I did upload some sounds or whatever. But at the end of the day, unless you've got a really specific project for it, yeah, it's so set in time where it is that I didn't find it particularly useful and ended up on selling it, which, as you, Paul, you know, I tend to do quite often.
Well, Greg likes flipping airplanes. You like flipping keyboards. I think we both know that. It's interesting, isn't it? I reckon with the DX7, as anyone at our vintage would know, David, every single hit pop record in the 80s had DX7 on it, and every video clip had someone using the DX7. I guess in part that's why we all wanted one when we were young adults. But the problem with it was such a hard thing to program. Everyone used all the stock sounds on it. So therefore, it really does put the keyboard very much of its time, which can make it sound a little bit dated to modern ears, unfortunately.
No, I'm in the hunt for a D50 next, but anyway, that's another story. So, So we better keep going. So, a big thank you to our gold and silver sponsors. So, first, Dave Bryce and the team at the musicplayer.com forums. Can't thank them enough for their ongoing support. Great forum if you would like to hang out with other keyboard players, etc. Highly recommended. Mike and the team from Midnight Mastering. Mike is an absolute legend, and I've mentioned a couple of episodes now, and it is coming. We've got an extra episode with Mike and another great guy, Steve Gregory, talking about our membership in what was the world's first virtual band back in the 90s. So that's coming.
You know, David, I think I might have a project for Mike too. I might need you to put me in touch with him. I think I need to have a job for him. So thank you for that recommendation. And thank you, Mike, for your support.
Yeah, absolutely. The wonderful Tammy Catcher from Tammy's Musical Stew. Thank you, Tammy, for your ongoing and consistent support. It's really appreciated. And I don't think I missed anyone. Oh, and Mr. Dewey Evans, the wonderful Dewey Evans, who is just a solo supporter who, as you'll hear when we do a live stream before the end of the year, wrote a really cool book on playing rock keyboards in the late 80s, I think it was. But we're going to talk about that. We've got Dewey coming on the show to talk about that soon. So Paul and I are looking forward to chatting with him. Most importantly, we thank you out there as always. Do keep on enjoying playing, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks, and we'll talk then. And that was a fucking tortured ending. Anyway,